You are earning more than you were 3 years ago. And your life still does not feel safe. The bills get paid. The calendar stays full. From the outside, everything looks like forward motion. But inside, there is a pressure that does not leave. A low-level anxiety that wakes up with you in the morning and follows you into the weekend. A feeling that you are always one bad month away from something breaking. And the part that confuses people is this: you are not reckless. You are not lazy. You are not ignoring the problem. You are doing more than most people around you, and yet the feeling of financial safety keeps moving further away, like a horizon you can never quite reach. Most people will tell you the answer is simple: earn more, spend less, be more disciplined. And I understand why that answer exists. It is clean. It is logical. It feels like it should work. But I do not think it goes deep enough. Because the people I am describing are not failing from lack of effort. They are failing because effort on its own does not build safety. Effort without the right structure just produces more motion. And motion that never converts into margin leaves a person exhausted, trapped, and quietly ashamed for reasons they cannot fully explain. That is what this is about. Not tips, not a budget checklist, not another push toward discipline you already have. We are going to look at 4 invisible mechanisms that turn hard work into permanent financial anxiety. Each one operates quietly. Each one feels normal from the inside. And together, they create a structure where effort is consumed faster than stability can ever be built. Once you see the structure, the shame starts to loosen, and the path forward becomes a little clearer. Let me start with a distinction that most financial conversations never make. There is a difference between income and safety. They are not the same thing. They do not automatically travel together. And confusing them is one of the most expensive mistakes a hardworking person can make. Income is what comes in. Safety is what survives. A person can have significant income and almost no safety. That is not a contradiction. That is a very common situation. It happens when income is large enough to feel meaningful but structured in a way that makes it nearly impossible for safety to accumulate. When every increase in what you earn is absorbed by an increase in what your life now costs, you are running faster and staying in the same place. And here is what makes this pattern so invisible. The life you are living looks responsible while it is happening. You are paying for things, managing things, keeping things running. From the outside, and even from the inside, it feels like progress. But there is a version of responsible-looking life that is quietly one of the most fragile structures a person can build. And the marker is not how much you earn. The marker is this: how much pressure can your life absorb without falling apart? If a single unexpected expense, a medical bill, a car repair, a slow month at work, creates genuine panic, you do not have safety. You have the appearance of stability. And the gap between those two things is where financial anxiety lives permanently. I want to be careful here, because this is where people often turn a structural observation into self-hatred. That is not the goal. The goal is diagnosis. You can be responsible, hardworking, and smart, and still be living inside a fragile structure. Because the structure is not built by your character alone. It is built by the pattern of choices your environment, your pressure, your comparisons, and your exhaustion have been making for you over years. The problem is not that you are broken. The problem is that you have been working hard inside a structure designed to keep you functioning, not to make you safe. Functioning and safe are not the same thing. And the distance between them is exactly what we are going to measure. The first trap does not look like a trap. It looks like your life getting better. It works like this. Your income increases. Not dramatically, maybe, but meaningfully. You get a raise. You pick up an additional income stream. And something very natural happens next. Your life expands to meet it. You move somewhere slightly better. You upgrade the car. You eat at slightly nicer places. You buy the things you told yourself you would buy when you could afford them. None of these things are absurd. Most of them feel earned. And the result is that your raise is now invisible. Your income grew, but so did the floor of your life. Your baseline expenses, your minimum cost of living the life you now consider normal, quietly rose to absorb what you gained. You are spending more per month than you were 2 years ago, but you do not feel richer. You feel like you are maintaining. Behavioral economists call this lifestyle inflation. But that name does not capture the emotional reality. What is actually happening is more personal. Your identity is expanding. Your definition of normal is upgrading. And every upgrade creates a new floor you now have to protect. The trap is not the spending. The trap is the structure underneath it. When your lifestyle expands faster than your margin grows, you are building a taller building on the same narrow foundation. Every floor you add makes the whole thing harder to sustain and more frightening to lose. Here is what that feels like from the inside. You work harder, earn more, live better by visible measures, but you do not feel more secure. Because security does not come from what you have. It comes from the gap between what you have and what your life requires to function. If that gap never grows, security never arrives. This is why many people who earn 2 or 3 times what they earned 5 years ago still live with constant financial anxiety. Not because they are irresponsible, because their income growth has been fully converted into lifestyle. And lifestyle, once established, is very difficult to reduce without it feeling like failure. A principle often associated with long-term wealth builders is this: the dangerous moment is not when your income is low. The dangerous moment is when your income rises and your margin does not rise with it. That is when effort becomes a treadmill instead of a ladder. And that is also where the second trap begins. Because once your life is structured around a high baseline, it starts making decisions for you. The second trap is emotional, not logical. And that is exactly why it is so hard to see. When you are working hard under consistent financial pressure, managing a life that gives you less breathing room than you need, something happens to your relationship with money. It stops being a tool you manage strategically. It starts being a form of relief you spend impulsively. This is not weakness. This is a predictable psychological response to sustained pressure. When a person is chronically exhausted, the brain begins optimizing for short-term comfort over long-term gain. Not because the person is undisciplined, but because the brain under stress genuinely calculates that future reward is less certain than present relief. The pattern looks like this. You have a hard week, a hard month, and somewhere in there, you spend money on something that was not necessary but felt deeply deserved. A meal out, new clothes, something to make the pressure softer for a moment. And for a few days, it works. The pressure does soften. But without realizing it, you have created a loop. The pressure drives the spending. The spending creates temporary relief. The relief resets and the pressure returns, now slightly worse because the margin just got a little thinner. And the next time the pressure rises, the same mechanism activates again. Over time, this loop becomes structural. It is not visible in the big categories. It lives in the small ones, the unplanned purchases on difficult days, the delivery food when motivation is gone, the subscriptions that accumulate because canceling them requires an energy that is always in short supply. None of these individual events is catastrophic. But together, they represent a financial leak that is directly proportional to emotional pressure. The harder your life becomes, the more money quietly exits. Not through one big mistake, but through hundreds of small relief decisions that seemed justified at the time. I do not think the solution to this trap is willpower. Telling someone who is exhausted to just resist comfort spending is like telling someone who is dehydrated to just stop being thirsty. The need is real. The problem is not the desire for relief. The problem is that relief is being funded by the future instead of by margin that already exists. When you have a buffer, you can afford relief without compounding the pressure. When you have no buffer, every act of relief is borrowed from stability you have not yet built. And that borrowing, repeated over months and years, is one of the quietest reasons why hard work never converts into safety. But even this is not the deepest layer. Underneath the relief spending loop, there is a third trap, one that is social and invisible, and it costs more than most people ever realize. The third trap is the one nobody admits to. Because admitting it requires acknowledging how much of your financial life is not actually about your needs. It is about your image. Not vanity, necessarily. Not shallowness. But something more fundamental and more human. The social cost of not looking like you are doing well. The cost of maintaining the visible signals of a life that is on track. The cost of not falling behind in the story that the people around you are telling about what a successful adult looks like. This is what I call the appearance burden. The car that costs more than you need because something cheaper would send a message you are not ready to send. The apartment in the neighborhood that reflects the person you are trying to be, not the financial position you are actually in. The clothes, the events attended, the vacations shared online, the general maintenance of a visible life that signals stability and progress to the people watching. Some of this is conscious. Most of it is not. It happens in dozens of micro-decisions every month, where the cheaper option was available and the more expensive one was chosen because of how the choice would look. Here is why this trap is especially dangerous for hardworking people. Working hard without visible results creates shame, and shame creates spending. When you are putting in serious effort, and your life does not yet reflect that effort in the ways others can see, the pressure to make it visible becomes enormous. You start buying the appearance of success before the substance of it is there, because the gap between how hard you are trying and how little it shows feels unbearable. A principle associated with long-term wealth builders is that the quieter your financial habits, the stronger your position tends to be. The people who accumulate genuine security are often the ones who made peace with looking ordinary while doing extraordinary things with margin. They stopped paying the appearance tax, and that tax, once eliminated, frees up significant amounts of money and emotional energy to actually build something. The appearance burden does not just cost money. It costs clarity. It keeps you spending for an audience instead of building for yourself. It makes every financial decision slightly more expensive because the social dimension adds a premium. And over years, the compounding cost of that premium is staggering. Not in any one purchase. In the cumulative weight of maintaining an image with money that should have been building a foundation. Which is exactly what makes the fourth trap the most devastating. Because by the time the expansion trap, the relief loop, and the appearance burden have been running for a few years, your timeline has quietly been stolen from you. The fourth trap does not feel like a trap while it is happening. It feels like life being busy. But here is what is actually occurring underneath the busyness. Every month that your income is fully consumed by lifestyle, appearance, and relief spending is a month where nothing compounds in your favor. And compounding is not just a financial concept. It is the underlying mechanism of everything that makes a life genuinely stronger over time. Skills compound, savings compound, margin compounds, the clear decision-making that comes from not being desperate compounds. All of it requires time, but only if the direction is already set. When the first three traps are active, no direction is set. Every month is a reset. Income arrives, gets absorbed by the structure, and exits. No safety accumulates. No skill investment gets funded. No buffer builds because every buffer that forms gets spent before it can grow. And the person living inside this structure works harder and harder, genuinely trying, and ends up in roughly the same financial position year after year. That is the compounding delay. Not a single bad decision. Not a catastrophic event. Just years of effort that never converted into momentum because the structure was not designed for it. And here is what it costs, emotionally. After enough years of this, a person begins to lose faith in their own effort. They start to believe that trying harder is not going to change anything. That the gap between where they are and where they want to be is permanent. That something about them is fundamentally broken because they are clearly willing to work, and yet security keeps failing to appear. That belief is not accurate, but it is understandable, because the structure has been teaching that lesson consistently. When effort never produces compounding results, effort starts to feel pointless. And when effort starts to feel pointless, the very discipline that was supposed to save the person begins to erode. This is what financial exhaustion actually is. Not laziness, not lack of ambition, but the specific psychological deterioration that happens when a hardworking person spends years building without ever seeing anything accumulate, when the motion never converts into progress. Understanding the four traps is not the end. It is the beginning. Because once you can see the structure, you can change it. You do not fix this all at once. You dismantle it one layer at a time. The first move is to stop the bleeding before you try to grow. Most people want to start with the aggressive step: earn more, invest more, reach the number faster. But trying to build when the leaks are still running is like filling a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The priority is not growth yet. The priority is stopping the reset. Take an honest look at your monthly structure. Not to shame yourself, to see it clearly. Identify the three biggest places where money exits without a deliberate decision. Not the obvious necessary expenses, the places where spending is emotional rather than strategic, where the appearance burden is most active. Name them. That naming alone is worth more than most financial advice. The second move is to create your first genuine buffer. Not a large one, not a perfect one, a real one. Even a small amount of money outside your monthly operating expenses changes the psychological structure of your life. It creates a layer between you and panic. When you are not operating from desperation, you make better choices. And better choices, repeated over months, change the trajectory. The third move is to protect one resource that is not money: your time. Time is the only thing that can produce a genuine change in leverage. If every hour of your week is consumed by maintaining the current structure, no new structure can be built. You need consistent access to 1 or 2 honest hours per week where you are working on your earning capacity and your options, rather than just servicing what already exists. Protect that time the way you would protect money you cannot afford to lose. The fourth move is to stop upgrading your visible life faster than your invisible foundation. Before the next lifestyle upgrade, ask whether your margin grew first. If your safety layer has not grown in the last 6 months, do not let your baseline grow either. Hold the floor. Let the gap between income and expenses widen, even slightly. That widening is where safety finally starts to accumulate. The fifth move is to raise the value of something you already do. Not by chasing a new career. By identifying the skill inside your current work that, made more specific or more demonstrable, would make you harder to replace and more valuable to pay well. Replaceable people get paid at replacement cost. People with specific, visible competence get paid closer to the value they produce. That gap, navigated intentionally, is one of the most reliable ways to increase income without simply increasing hours. None of these moves is dramatic. None of them promises overnight transformation. That is intentional. The goal is to change the direction of compounding. Because once the direction changes and the structure stops resetting every month, the same effort that felt like it was going nowhere starts producing results that accumulate quietly over time. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If you have been working hard for years and still feel financially unsafe, I want you to understand something clearly. That feeling is not proof that you are broken. It is feedback that the structure underneath your effort is not aligned with the outcome you are working toward. You have been running inside a pattern built by 4 invisible forces: lifestyle expansion, relief spending, the appearance burden, and a compounding delay that turns years of effort into motion without progress. None of these traps require bad decisions to operate. They only require that you remain unaware of them. And now, you are not. The goal from here is not perfection. It is not eliminating every comfort or becoming a monk of financial discipline. It is something quieter and more durable, making your life slightly harder to break, building one layer of breathing room, letting margin accumulate, even slowly, so that each month you are a little less at the mercy of ordinary setbacks. The first sign of real financial progress is not a number in an account. It is a feeling. A quiet reduction in the background anxiety that has been running underneath your life. A moment where an unexpected expense arrives and instead of panic, there is a problem to solve. That shift is the beginning of safety. Cut one leak, not all of them. 1. the most honest one, the one you already know about but have been avoiding. Build one buffer, not a large one, a real one. Protect 1 hour, every week, without negotiation. That hour belongs to the version of your life that is not yet visible, but is absolutely possible. And then do it again next week. Not because discipline is easy, but because the direction has changed. And direction, held consistently, is how ordinary effort eventually becomes something you can actually live inside without fear. You are not trying to impress anyone. You are trying to become harder to break. That is the work. And it is already in progress. If this kind of calm, long-term financial thinking is what you are trying to build, stay with this channel. That is the work we are doing here.